Thank you so much. So I'll be talking about contextual privacy, and I need just to make a small note that I have absolutely I'm only a computer scientist. So when I talk about sensitivity in particular, I just refer to it as the technical term means for computer sciences. So and this work is the work of my PhD, so I'll go a little bit into some hopefully interesting findings. So the motivation to look into contextual privacy is that the importance of context in the recent years, because it's not really a construct that could be easily captured by the relationship of a doctor and a patient, for instance. It's a construct that has multiple dimensions, especially with this era, in this era where data could go everywhere and contexts vary from offline to online and so on. But since the beginning of privacy research in computer sciences, the importance of protecting sensitive data was also realized. And of course, we try to develop privacy-enhancing technologies to facilitate controlling sensitive data and context. The problem is that these two concepts are very difficult to identify. So there are no clear rules about what makes data sensitive, and context as a like complicated construct is really difficult to control in general. So that's why we got interested into trying to understand contextual privacy, and what is it that actually makes this relationship between context and sensitive, and maybe then we could start making better approaches. But from the very beginning of privacy research in computer sciences, the attempts were to try and classify military data as sensitive data. But then over the years, there were more categories that were agreed upon as being sensitive, for instance, political views, health data, and so on, especially with the guidelines of the Data Protection Directive that identified these topics as sensitive. Yet, as technical people, we are really interested into trying to find this sensitivity function. What is it exactly that makes certain data items sensitive and others not? And the only thing that we know till now is that topics and semantics do play a role into affecting sensitivity, but we really don't have a greater idea about that. So, and also, one thing is that we know that context seems to have a relationship with sensitivity, but we don't really know how does this work. So let's talk this scenario of a recent event, I'd say, in which this photo could be viewed in different contexts, and depending on the context, the sensitivity of this photo might vary. And I hope that the scenario is clear, but we could also go into another scenario where the very simple user of social media wanting to share a photo of doing something fun at home. And the problem is that it is so easy to disclose this photo on different contexts. However, it's only in a particular context that this photo suddenly becomes sensitive. And the complexity of trying to build contextual privacy tools is that users are expected to control every single disclosure of their data, every single dissemination, and decide for themselves whether this is appropriate or not. The problem gets even more complicated given the fact that the number of contexts could be unlimited. So it's not even reasonable, even if there exist such tools to control all possible contexts, users won't be able to make use of that. So, we would like to actually better understand this relationship between contexts. What is it that makes particular contexts affect a particular, probably benign photo to become suddenly sensitive? And this gives us more of a motivation to try and understand this sensitivity function and look into more details about it. So we worked on empirical analysis to try to understand this relationship and find this function to a certain degree. We were lucky that we could access search data at Microsoft. We looked into how people disclose, how people search for items on Bing. So we could see what queries are submitted, and then afterwards how these queries were managed in the search history. So of course the user could either delete or keep a data item. And the assumption is that a deletion is mostly motivated by some sense of sensitivity of this item or inappropriateness, even if it's only the fact that the user does not want the server to use this item for advertisement, for instance. But there is some implicit, latent aspect of sensitivity or inappropriateness that the user is trying to protect somehow. So this was the assumption that we started with. And then we were very lucky to access 226 million data items collected from 400,000 US users. And for each query, of course, we had different attributes. So we were able to access the topics. Bing normally classifies the topics of each query, so makes a relationship analysis of the topics that each query relates to. So that in this case, like this query is related to health and beauty and question and answers topics. We could know the time of the submission of the query, the context that represents the offline context where the user is, at home or not, and online contextual information as the type of browser, the type of service this query was submitted from. Of course, we had the deleted flag that indicated this latent variable of sensitivity. So we don't have any explicit variable that says through which the user says this is sensitive for me and I'm deleting it. But the assumption was it's latent. And we had some information about the user. Of course, it was well anonymized. And therefore, we continued with the analysis. So as I said, we are interested in analyzing sensitivity to start with. And we were after trying to understand if there's one particular pattern that could explain the behavior, the deletion management pattern of all these users and of all these data queries. So we were hoping to find actually some formula like if topic is X and context is Y and time is Z, then we could tell with a certain accuracy if this item is sensitive or not. And we were also interested into looking into this function of sensitivity and see what are the factors that do affect this function. So context, subjectivity, temporality. So we looked into these. And on the other hand, we also wanted to understand how context would affect sensitivity. So we were after trying to understand whether context has an effect on how people disclose certain search queries. So if I know that context is X, could I tell what type of topic would be disclosed here or not? So this would give some understanding of the appropriateness decision making based on context. And we also wanted to understand how would also context affect the post-disclosure patterns or the sensitivity management pattern, in the sense like, for instance, if I add more contextual parameters, could I even predict the sensitivity of data with a higher accuracy, for instance? So that would sort of indicate that context does have quite an important effect on how people manage their data. And I think the good news is that we found very some evidence for contextuality of sensitivity. So we started with just trying to understand what are the topics that are mostly deleted or considered sensitive by the users. So the line, does this work? Okay, so this line here shows the items that are mostly deleted, and we see that adult topics are at the top, and then secondly, celebrities seems to be topics that are sensitive to the majority of users. However, we also looked into how individual users would delete their items, and we validated or we checked the standard deviation of these variations, of these behaviors. And then we found that the majority of users would actually consider adult as as a very sensitive topic, so there's an agreement on deleting this topic. But for celebrities, not all users consider it sensitive and they delete it. So that's the first clue, that topics are not the only, do not seem to be the only parameter that affects sensitivity, but there's some subjectivity in deciding on sensitivity, of course. The second thing is actually putting the data into some magical machine learning algorithms and seeing whether we could find a pattern that would predict sensitive data, and we did find that. And it was really nice, and it showed, the pattern showed that all these dimensions of topics and context and time, if we want to consider time a different contextual aspect. So these three aspects do all collaborate to predict sensitivity. So it's not only topics, as normally sensitivity is viewed. And when we looked at these topics, we found, the usual suspect, the adult topic being at the top of the list. But we also found topics like clothes and shoes and flight status as being indicative of sensitive items. And that is quite surprising, because the common world knowledge about sensitivity does not include these topics in the set of sensitive topics. So that was quite interesting. And then when we look at the contextual factors that do predict sensitivity, we see that the interests of users in particular items seem to indicate some sense of some sensitivity. So we found that search history as a factor the more the user searches for a particular item, the more likely that this item is to be deleted. And we found also, the more the user goes through different verticals to find the result, the more likely that this item would be deleted. So this probably suggests that the items that the users are mostly interested in seem to have some notion of sensitivity, or the user would like to protect this data. And when we go to the offline context, I'll just jump over for the safe search setting, when it's put to strict, there's also a higher probability that the user would delete these items. So strict, that means no adult, nothing. So I think the user is in a very privacy and appropriate mode of searching. And when we go to offline context, we found that users who submit their queries from Windows Live services seems to be more keen on deleting and managing their data than users who access search engine from their Facebook account. So this is interesting, because it actually might suggest that, given the service that users are exposed to, so in Facebook, maybe the fact that people are always sharing lots of data, then it makes it maybe not necessary to think about what data to delete and what data to keep, and so on. And of course, we found time also as a good or an indicator of sensitivity as well. But we wanted to analyze the temporal aspect of the sensitivity pattern further. So we split the data set into sub-data sets based on the month that the data was collected in. And we did the same, we applied the same machine learning approach. So we had, in this case, six different patterns. And when we at least look at the topics that indicate sensitivity, not all topics are consistently persistent in these patterns. So this suggests that also the indicativeness of topics of sensitivity varies across time. And we also did the same thing at the user level. So we split the data to subsets, and subsets that represent individual users. And we did the same. We did the same pattern inferencing, and we also found that patterns of users do vary significantly in what topics they seem to be indicative of sensitivity and so on. So this just brings another evidence that temporality and subjectivity are do affect how people reason about the sensitivity of their data. So just to summarize, and what we refer as sensitivity function in this case is the pattern that we learn, because the outcome of the machine learning algorithm is actually a formula, a function. So the work shows that context, content, subjectivity, and temporality are all aspects that affect reasoning about sensitivity. And then when we went to understanding how context affects the management or like disclosure of data items. So we were interested in this case to see, for instance, if the user, or how would like being at home and being not at home, would they have a significant effect on how people would disclose certain data from different topics. So when we look at the topic adult, for instance, we see that being at home positively affect the intensity of data items disclosed within this topic, while being not at home negatively affect the intensity of disclosing these data items. But for other topics, like the flight status topic, does not seem to be affected by either of these contexts. So it is the same. People disclose the same amount across these two contexts, and that's quite an interesting finding, because it also suggests that the context seem to be involved in the process of deciding what is appropriate to disclose or not. If it weren't, then everything would have been white. Like context would have no effect on that. And when we went further and checked the effect of context on post-disclosure patterns, we also found that, so in this case we did the sensitivity pattern inference, but we added just extra contextual information. So we added, for instance, information about the anonymization methods or tools the user is using, or whether the user is using anonymization or not. We added information about what type of work the user have. And we found that when people, we found that the more contextual parameters that we add to our algorithm, the more accurate the prediction is. And and then we found that when people are not using anonymization tools, they seem to be more keen on deleting their items, while when they are using anonymization tool, this would have a negative effect on the deletion rate. So maybe the user has some sense of protection when using anonymization, that they don't feel like they need to delete or manage sensitive data. And when we look at the offline context, we found, for instance, people who work for government, medical organizations, or religious organizations are more keen to delete and manage their data than others who work for instance, for internet service providers. But what this tells us is that the more context information we have, the more we can learn about sensitivity. And the interesting finding is this about users using pets could have a false sense of protection, but yet it's interesting, I think, to consider. And what we could conclude from that is that contextual privacy, in that sense, based on this inference of this sensitivity function, could actually be used to develop privacy-enhancing technologies that would make use of the sensitivity function. And instead of asking the user to control all these unlimited number of contexts, we could use just this sensitivity function to try and indicate when the sensitivity changes in a particular context. And based on that, the user could be nudged somehow, or could be informed, like, hey, there's a dissemination of your item, and this item seems to be sensitive in this context. Would you allow this dissemination or not? This is something that I will not be talking further about today. And the conclusions from this work is, of course, firstly, that these ingredients just contribute to the fact that sensitivity cannot be thought of as something separated from context, for sure. And the patterns that we inferred and the findings, our findings, are most probably only applicable on the data from Microsoft, from the search engine, from US users. But it just suggests that such an analysis is useful to try and better understand sensitivity, and that would be the first step towards deciding what data to protect and how. The other issue here is that we need to be aware and probably critical about using the term sensitivity or inappropriateness. The problem is that we could not interview users and actually ask them why were they doing these deletions. So it was the researcher's assumption. But I think in real life scenarios, users need to be brought to the decision-making table, and that they need to be part of the process. That is, I think, more of a wish list for me personally, is that since we have these deletion mechanisms in all big services, but they actually do not, you just indicate that an item, you need an item to be deleted, but at the server side, it's only indicated as deleted, but it's not really deleted. So the question is that, will there be a point in time, especially with the GDPR and the right of erasure, that these deletion functionalities would be actually made as they were supposed to work? And finally, the scenario that I would like to discuss maybe later is that if, for instance, a person, a user, a data subject goes to court and says, hey, the search engine has sold my searches about Ariana Grande to a third party. And to me, I consider this as sensitive and it should not be sold. Would the court in that case just refer to the legal tools? Or would the court somehow say, okay, some research or some scientists have identified celebrity topics as being sensitive, and then maybe the verdict would be different. And with that, I would like to thank you very much and welcome your questions.